Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Deborah, and this is Human Potential at Work. I'm the CEO of Rue Global Communications, and we are strategists and market influencers for the community of people with disabilities in the aging market. Today, I want to talk about a topic that I recently spoke to Dr. Caroline Casey about on an interview we did with her with Access Chat. Access Chat, AXS Chat, is another program that I co-host with Neil Milliken and Antonio Santos. And if you want to see that interview with Dr. Caroline Casey, it is at www.axschat.com/Caroline-Casey-2. Because we had interviewed her another time. So this is the second time we interviewed her. And Caroline Casey, as a reminder of anybody that doesn't know this amazing woman, is she just got disability inclusion on the world stage at the World Economic Forum, and she is the CEO of the Valuable 500, where and I'm lucky to be a partner with her, but we're focused on getting corporations to commit to including disability inclusion in the boardroom. So very, very important conversation. And I started this conversation with Caroline. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. So I have asked my producer, Doug Foresta, to join me on the conversation. And as a reminder, Doug has his own program. It's called Mind Chat, and I would highly recommend you listening to it. Doug is a licensed clinical worker. I always say it wrong. Social worker. I consistently say that wrong, Doug, but okay. It's a very powerful conversation that he's having on Mind Chat about Mind Talk. Excuse me, I'm confusing the chat, but Mind Talk. And I believe it's a very, very powerful conversation about mental health in all aspects of it. And Doug, before we start this conversation, and tell the audience a little bit more about Mind Talk.
Oh, thank you very much. So yeah, the program is about exactly that, all things mind, everything from mental health to meditation to dealing with death and dying, but really about what do we need to do to keep our minds healthy.
Right. And with all of the things happening to society right now with our brains and the stress that we're under, I just think it's very powerful. I know, of course, my husband is, sometimes the right word does feel battling dementia, which is attacking his brain. And we're walking this journey. It's a very interesting, sometimes very frightening journey, but then along the way, you have these really beautiful little surprises that step in. It's like, wow, that's so cool. We are all on a journey, and we all, I think most of us want to be the best human beings that we can be. And so this is one reason why we bring these programs to you. So Mind Talk is a really, really powerful show, and I highly recommend you watch it. And you can find Mind Talk on our website, ruglobal.com. So ruhglobal.com. So today we want to tackle a conversation that, once again, I started with Dr. Caroline Casey, which is who gets to belong, who should be representing, and who gets to belong, who should be representing the community of people with disabilities, especially when it is such a big community. We're over 1 billion people, and the numbers shift and change depending on who you ask, depending upon which countries have census or not. I've mentioned this before, but the CDC in 2018 did a report that said that 1 in 4 Americans identify as having a disability, which means that's 25% of the population. In Canada, in the UK, it's 1 in 5. According to the World Health Organization, and this report is a few years old, they estimate 1 in 7, but many countries don't do census bureaus. So, right. But it's such a broad community, right, Doug? So who is represented in this? We're representing people with mental health illnesses. We're representing people that have chronic illnesses like cancer and diabetes. We're representing people with epilepsy, people that are blind, people with vision loss, people with hearing loss, people that are deaf, hard of hearing, people like my daughter that has intellectual disabilities, also called developmental disabilities, so Down syndrome and alcohol fetal syndrome. And I mean, just think of the broadness of this community. And then, of course, also people like my husband with dementia, and others with Alzheimer's, and we're just really big. And so what I've started seeing happening in the United States is some of the corporate brands are saying, well, maybe we should only work with people that have physical disabilities so that people can see that we're talking about.
I would say visible, right? Because there are physical,
thank you,
non-visible disabilities, right?
Right. Good point. And there's, the reality is there's probably more people with disabilities that are hidden and invisible than there are people that we can, if we can see, visually get the cues. If you can see, you can visually see that my daughter has Down syndrome. And so you're immediately going to get cues about who she is, And if you see someone with a guide dog, you're going to immediately assume certain things. If you see somebody, sometimes it's interesting. I know this one man, he always wore black glasses on this show called, I think it was a paranormal investigation, or it's something like, I forget exactly what it is, but his name is John Oliver, and he's this terrific psychic. And I remember when I first saw the show, I wondered if he was blind because he was wearing dark glasses. And he explains in the show that no, he wears these glasses so that he's not distracted. So it's funny, the assumptions sometimes you make and you don't even realize you're making them. I guess those are the unconscious bias.
Or you could see someone in a wheelchair and assume they're disabled, but maybe they actually broke their leg and it's healing,
so
and
they're temporarily
disabled. Exactly.
Right. And often in this community, we will say, if you are not part of the community, if you don't have a family member or a loved one that's part of this community, just wait. Exactly. And you will be. But that comes across to me, Doug, sometimes as sort of a threat or a fear-based thing.
Exactly. Right. Yes.
Right. And one more comment, and then I'm going to get you a lot more engaged. I was speaking at a Jewish event, this wonderful event, and somebody in the audience asked me what I thought the greatest barrier was to this community. And I said, well, I think the greatest barrier to this community, because there's so many barriers, but one of the greatest barriers is that many people that are part of this community do not self-identify as being part of this community. And so many people that fall under the definitions, and we're going to look at two definitions. The Americans with Disabilities Act, looking at it from U.S. lens, has a definition. Right. And then pretty much all the other countries are looking at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, their definitions, and the definitions are a little different. So, and since the United States has not ratified the UNCRPD, we are looking at the lens of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's very broad and a lot of people are included. So who gets to represent us in this community?
Right.
That's what we want to talk about
today. Thorny question, right? It's not a question. This is not one of those episodes where we're going to have, these are the 5 things you need to do. It's really hopefully the beginning of a dialogue. I will say this morning, I went to my son's school for a 504 meeting.
Yes.
And
explain 504 for anyone.
Right. Well, that's what my son was like. So 504 is a federal civil rights legislation that I believe predates the ADA.
It does. It is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Okay.
And the 504 is one of
the sections.
508 is one also that a lot of Americans know, which says that, everything has to be, your website has to be accessible, and 503 and, but 504.
So 504 is that particular part about non-discrimination and making sure that opportunities are accessible for individuals. So my son has ADHD, and so he has had a 504 plan since he was, in first grade. So he is legally, right, by legal definition, he is legally disabled. If you looked at him, other than being almost 14-year-old boy, which I think could very well be a disability in itself. Right. Also IEP. Yeah. In Massachusetts, the 504 plans are a little different than an IEP plan. It's a little less comprehensive, but yes.
But all about education.
But all about education.
Sure
right.
that Sam has what he needs to be successful in education.
Right. But the reason I mention it is that he looks fully able and capable. He's very bright. He has like a 148 IQ. So, you put him on a panel, right? He's not going to look, whatever that means, disabled. And there is a problem. I mean, let me say this. There is a problem that happens, and it happens not only in the disability community, but outside the disability community. I'll bring up the idea of there was a really funny SNL sketch, was funny but true, and it was a bunch of men, and they brought these women in, and they said, "Did you know that women are more likely than others to be discriminated against?" And they kept talking at the women, and they wouldn't let the women speak at all. Like, we need to do something. Women don't have a voice in the workplace, and every time the women tried to speak up, they just spoke over them.
Oh, that's hysterical.
It does happen. I'm sure you've been to panels where it's all white. Let's face it, it's all white men, right? It's all white men, and they're talking about diversity. And they all look visibly able. We don't know whether they are or not, but visibly they look able. And there is something that is troubling about that. I mean, at least I'm speaking from my own perspective. I think there is something troubling about that, because there's not, how can we talk about a community? I know that that's a big thing in the disability community, right? Nothing about us without us. So I totally understand the importance of visibly seeing, recognizing and seeing, if I'm a child and I'm in a wheelchair, and I don't see anyone in a wheelchair on a panel ever. I go to things and no one is in a wheelchair. Nobody, there's no models in wheelchairs when I look at ads. The visual representation is really important. I think the question though is, what does that mean for those of us who maybe are allies, right? By the way, you can't call yourself an ally. It's like calling yourself attractive. It doesn't work. Or, I don't want to joke, but I'm hilarious.
But I do think allies, that is a good word, because
it's a good word if other people use it for us. And it's a goal. It should be a goal, like that we should, not a label, but a goal for us. So I guess, Deborah, I mean, what has been your experience? And have you ever had an experience where someone said, "I'm sorry, Deborah, you're just not disabled enough to really, speak at our event or represent us"?
I have had multiple things like that happen. Now, I'm a well-known voice in this community, and so it doesn't really happen anymore. But when I first started my business, Tech Access, I had people say to me, "Well, nobody is going to listen to you because you are a parent," and parents are often problems when it comes to people with disabilities. And I'm like, what? Well, isn't it best for as many of us to be in here championing this community as possible? And then, of course, I can get out the definition of, what it means to have a disability, which most of us are part of. But it is very interesting. But there's been recently some troubling things. I mentioned this, I think, on the interview we did with Dr. Caroline Casey, but I know a very large multinational brand that they really wanted to take their products and make them more accessible to people with disabilities, and make sure that, we consumed their products and understood that they were making an effort. And so they hired a woman that she was a young woman, and she had a visible disability. And I'm sure this woman was amazing. But the problem was she didn't really know how to strategically guide them so that they could be successful in the community. And so now this multinational corporation, they failed, and so they're actually backing out. And that breaks my heart, because if we can't come together as a community totally together, all of us, visible and non-visible allies, loved ones. Caroline Casey in the interview on Access Chat had made a really good point that it's like, her brother, her husband, her mother have just as much of an investment in this community as she does, and they're totally supporting her. And we need us all to pull together and be part of these conversations. But at the same time, there is something to be said when a person, I had this one gentleman that was a partner, and he was in a wheelchair. He used a wheelchair. He has CP, cerebral palsy. And he said to me, Deborah, when you walk in the room, you introduce that you're talking about disability inclusion. When I come in the room, everybody knows at some point this conversation might be about disabilities.
Right.
And he said, but it's important for you to be in the room because sometimes people like talking to people like them so that they can try to understand the rest of the community. So the nuances are very interesting.
Yes.
And I was speaking on another panel, and there was a woman next to me, and she said, I was invited to be part of this commission in a state. No, I won't mention which state. And she said, and can you believe it? They never had anybody with a disability on there. No, shame on them. Blah, blah. So I was the first person with a disability to be on there. And I thought, well, how do you know that? Because many people don't disclose. We don't start it out with saying, hey, I'm Deborah Rue.
Right.
And I struggle with depression and
Right.
a little bit ADHD, which probably anybody that's met me can figure out, but we also can save the world with those things.
That's
but
right.
So we don't, so there's a deficit. And I, on this same panel, there was a really, really amazing young woman. She was 21 and she was using a walker, and she has a visible disability. And she said, and I think I've mentioned this on air before, she said that people will come up to her and pray for her and say, in your next life, God's going to heal you, so you're perfect. And she's
Oh
like,
my God.
I am perfect. What are you talking about?
Right.
Get away from me.
Yeah.
So I feel that the younger people are really owning more who they are. Also, as most of you know, I'm very active on social media, and there is a tag on social media called Actually Autistic. And I find the people that tweet and chatter with that tag so interesting because they're really owning who they are. And who are you if you're a person with autism? Well, I don't know. There's so many people that our brains work so many different ways, but
Yeah.
I do not see that as a negative and a disadvantage. I think you probably are very creative and using your brain in all these interesting ways. So that's why we named this show, and you actually are the one that named the show, Doug, but that's why we named it Human Potential at Work, because we all have a potential. We all have abilities, and we all have disabilities. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and it's important for us to focus on our weaknesses so that we can be better and all those things that we talk about. But there is a troubling trend of some people saying, well, you can't speak for me, and you can't speak for not me personally, but you can't speak for our community unless you are in a wheelchair, or unless you're deaf, and I think it's dangerous. And I also think instead we need to be doing community building, and we need to say, what do we do to come together to build our community? And a wonderful example of community building is the LGBT community. When the lesbians came together with, they all came together.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that community has its own, all of us have intersectional identities, right? Yes. So if I'm a white man in a wheelchair, there's privilege going on because I'm white, I'm a man, and then there's oppression going on because I'm in a wheelchair. I think that representation, it's such a thorny and interesting and rich thing for us to talk about because, and I'm really curious, for everyone listening, please, send us your questions and thoughts if you're in the Facebook, comment on Facebook. But representation is really important. Look at Congress. Look at the Democratic Congress versus the Republican Congress right now. I'm not going to get political because it's not really actually about ideology that I have a problem with. It's more the Republican Party has a problem. Everyone is old and white and men. And the whole country isn't old white men. And
Right.
so,
Right.
that's a problem of representation. The optics of that are bad because the question becomes: only old white men these were the only candidates we could find were old white men, and they're going to represent everyone and everyone's lived experience. And then you look at the new Congress that has come in, right? And you've got all these
Yes.
different people. We need the visual representation of someone in a wheelchair. We need to
Right.
see more people in wheelchairs because it will break down the stigma for people who, for example, I said this to someone the other day. I said, how many people, when you go out in public, how many people do you see in wheelchairs when you go out? And the answer, at least in my experience, is very few, very few. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the big reasons being we don't build accessible structures so that
Right.
people in wheelchairs can get around, right?
Right. Right.
It's not like
And
they don't
still,
want to.
still, after 28 years of the Americans with Disability Act, still
Right.
people in wheelchairs have a hard time navigating things.
That's correct.
It's ridiculous. And so guess what?
Right.
If your restaurant or your business is
Right.
not accessible to people in wheelchairs,
Right.
those of us that have family members in wheelchairs or in wheelchairs ourselves,
Right.
we're not going to come and eat at your restaurant. We're not going to
That's right.
come and do business at your bank. So,
Right.
and we have made progress. I will say that the United States is so much more accessible now, and in a lot of ways, we are as accessible as probably any other country. And we still have a lot of work to do. But
And we still have a lot of work to do. But
yeah,
so visible representation is very important,
I
right?
agree.
And how many times, I mean, oh my God, I can't think of how many. I saw a meme. It said, why don't we stop talking about diversity and just actually just hire some diverse talent? How many organizations where they have the diversity team and everyone is all white and everyone's all able and everyone's all, picking on white people here, but you know what I'm saying? Everyone's all of a dominant majority and they're all talking about diversity. But
Right, I agree. And can I, while we're doing
yeah,
thorny subjects, I don't like the term able. And the reason why I do
yeah,
like it, of course I like it, but it suggests if we're going to use they're able-bodied, it
right.
suggests to me that people that are in a wheelchair or different are not able, and they
Right.
are
Or
certainly able.
not disabled, but
Right.
unable, right?
Right. And they are a lot, sometimes they are not
Right.
able because we don't make things accessible
I
or
was
we
gonna say they're unable to get a job. They're unable to get into the
right,
crappy building
because
that you.
society is doing a
Right.
horrible job with this.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
and I know those words are recognized and
No, it's
used,
a good point.
just sometimes they bother me because it seems like, and I remember we had that wonderful man on that was with Pinterest.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and he said he made a comment that he felt that if a product or a service was not designed so that we all could use it, that the designer was at fault because the
Absolutely.
designer was putting, they were, they were putting these barriers in there. It's
Yeah.
certainly not the fault of people with disabilities.
I know. Yeah, we could do a whole program just on the idea of disability as a social construct because it absolutely is, or
Because
ability as a social construct, right?
right, right. And I see
Yeah.
still, I recently saw an article where somebody was talking about, let's take the dis out of ability, and I thought, okay, I hear you. But
Yeah.
the reality is let's instead focus on what makes us human and what makes us unique. And the reality, having somebody that is using a walker or somebody that's using a cane or a service dog or and I'll give you a funny example about two funny examples about service dogs, but it allows us to understand that the differences and it allows us to learn from each other. And so
Yeah.
we shouldn't look at somebody that has a service animal as blind as less than us, because how in the world would I know that you're less than me? And you're probably not at all. You're a human being that brings all these things to the table. But just two funny stories about
Yeah.
people with service animals. So just because I was talking to my sister this morning, but she just started working for Lowe's and she's so excited about working for Lowe's. And she said that one of her coworkers has a service animal. And she said now, and she knows a lot about this business because she's been in this field too. And she said, when I look at him, I can't tell why he's using a service animal, but of course it's not my business to
Right.
determine whether or not this man needs a
Right.
service animal, but this is a service animal. And she said, so customers are always coming up to him, wanting to pet the dog. And I said, okay,
You can't do that. Yeah.
Right, but is the service animal, does it have its, its jacket on and all the things that it designates it as a service animal? And she said, oh yeah, very clearly. And she said, and people come up and say, well, what kind of disability do you have? And she said, it irritates this man.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, well, and I could understand that, but at the same time, sometimes people are just seeking to understand. It's not meant negatively. And then I got to tell a funny story about a service animal, which my mother did not think was funny, by the way, but I took her to the CSUN conference, which is a really big disability inclusion conference in California. And my mother kept going up to the service animals and petting them. And I kept saying, Mom, stop petting the service animals. They're working. They're working. And it clearly says, do not
Do
pet
not
me.
pet the
I'm
service
working.
animal. Right.
So she wouldn't stop. And I think she started doing it just to,
Bother.
aggravate me at that
Yeah.
point. So we got in an elevator, and there was just coincidentally, there was a handsome man in there that was blind with a very beautiful service animal. And so my mother says, we're in the elevator, the three of us, well, the four of us, including the service animal. My mother says, oh, you're so cute, aren't you? You are so cute. And I said, Mama, stop flirting with this man. You don't know who he is. And the man's like thinking, oh my God, just let me get out of this.
Who is this crazy woman I got stuck in the elevator with?
Two crazy people in
Yeah.
this elevator. But I think often, and
Yeah.
this woman I was mentioning, this
Yeah.
young woman that was using a walker, she said children will say, Mommy, what is wrong with that girl? And the parents just freak. And the young woman said, I would really rather them let the children ask me some questions and let me answer them instead of them being so mortified that
Right,
children
and run
are being
away. And
curious.
what's the message? Like, oh my God, that's terrible. Don't look at that. It's just
Right, right.
something.
So,
Yeah.
and we're talking about, once again, all the nuances that has to do with this community. But I think we could get in big trouble in this community, or, we could, maybe I would say that differently. Maybe we can't really move into to our real power of the strength of this community. With people with hidden and visible disabilities and the allies that support us, if
Well,
everyone
that's
is not welcome.
so that's the other piece. So having said that, I think it is really important that there be visual representation, just like there's visual representation of people who are clearly Asian or clearly African American, or right. We need to see those people, not just white people talking about African American people. That's important. At the same time, I also want to say that I think it's very self-defeating for communities if they say, go away, we don't want your support because you are whatever, right? So like
are
for
not
myself,
disabled enough,
right, or disabled at all, like,
or you don't make the cut of the disability. So is
right,
one disability more than another? Yeah, there's so many.
and I think it's how we position ourselves. So I have never, in terms of my own work, wanting to help others to have a voice, right? It's about sharing my platform and using my power and privilege to help others.
Right.
So I understand that I have power and privilege. I don't deny that I don't deny.
But you've worked hard for it too. It wasn't just gifted to you because you're a
well,
white Jewish.
yes and no. I mean, the whole point of privilege is that you don't work hard for it at all. In fact, there are many privileges in my life that I just experienced.
Good point.
So one of them being, I can walk tonight if I wanted to go downtown. Wouldn't be the best idea. It's kind of cold, and but I could walk around at night about 6 or 7 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. If I walk by myself, I'm 45, I'm relatively decent shape guy. I could walk around by myself. I'm not worried about being sexually assaulted. I'm not worried that a man is going to jump out of the bushes and sexually assault me. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I'm just saying,
right.
For the most part, I have the privilege, just because I weigh a certain amount and I have a certain amount of strength and a certain amount of whatever, right? And most men are not going to want, most of the men are just not going to want to do that. That I don't have to really think about being sexually assaulted.
Okay.
If I was in prison, that'd be a different story, maybe, right? If I walk into a store, people, I've had this happen, when I get a ticket or something, police officers say, you look like a good guy. Well, what does a good guy look like, right?
Well, that's it. Right.
We could unpack that, but part of that probably means I look like them, or I look like one of their family members, and they tend to look. Right. You see what I mean? You look like a good guy.
I do.
So privilege is unearned. It is by definition unearned, and I do have and I do experience on a daily basis unearned privileges. I'm a
I do
middle-aged
too.
white man, and right, and
Right.
you experience some,
And we're in a developed country.
and we're
Yeah,
in a developed
there's,
country. Oh
yeah,
my God,
yeah,
yes, I'm an
yes,
American citizen.
right,
I
right,
mean, I didn't earn
yes,
that, right? I just, that's where my parents happen to be. So I do have unearned privileges, but the question is, what do I do with them, right? Do I try to
right,
use my privilege in service of others who don't have it? First of all, I
right.
acknowledge it. Second of all, right, but if someone says to me, F off because you're not one of us and we don't need you, I think that's really self-defeating. I'm
I do
sorry.
too. I
I
do
think
too.
that's very stupid, actually. I'll put it.
Right. I agree. And we talked a little bit about I was fascinated
Yeah.
with Rachel
Those
Dozal.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Those all.
for those of you that don't recognize her name, she's going to live on in infamy, but I mean, she's still alive, but she she is a white woman that posed as being an African American woman, and she was working with the NAACP, and she was a big proponent, and she was, very, very critical of all those bad white people with all their unconscious,
Right.
blah blah blah.
Right.
And of course, she turned out to be white, so that was
But what
that
was the problem there, right? So the problem there, if you think about it, wasn't that she was doing work with the NAACP.
oh no,
The
nope.
problem is that she was representing herself as being marginalized and oppressed, when in fact she had a choice.
And she was mad about all of that too. She
Yeah.
was really mad that she had been oppressed and held
Right.
back because she was African American. And
I mean, that's like
yes,
me sitting, that's as offensive to me as me sitting in a wheelchair, right? Knowing that I can fully walk. And I start, wheeling myself around and everybody's, but meanwhile, I can choose to get up anytime I want.
right. And we've had that happen a lot. And so I do understand a lot of it. I know that, our community is really good at spotting if you put a pretty model in a wheelchair and they're just sitting there.
Yeah.
We can tell very quickly that you've done that. If you want to show us representation of disabilities, and you want to show us, a beautiful woman in a wheelchair, please select, because there's so many beautiful women
Right.
in wheelchairs, or men, but just using that as an example, please be authentic. It's about being
Yeah.
authentic, because we can
Yeah.
tell when you're not authentic. And we've got to work really hard to make sure that all voices are heard. Why would I talk about what it's like to be a person with autism? I don't have autism.
Right.
Now, I have a lot of friends and family members that have autism, but why
Right.
not instead let somebody that is actually autistic speak for themselves? So I know that you and I are totally both on the same page when it comes to that, but when I hear people say, well, you shouldn't be speaking for, not
Right.
once again, not pointing at me, but you shouldn't be speaking for us
Right.
because you don't have a visible disability,
Right.
that really worries me, since so many people don't have,
Right.
visible disability. So it's also, we've talked about this a little bit too, the representation in the media, Hollywood, Bollywood, YouTube. There's so many ways of getting access to content now, but it's interesting. The other day I was watching a really beautiful movie. It's called The Fundamentals of Caring. And it's a few years old, and it was wonderful. And the man that was playing the main role was a young man with a severe disability, and he was really funny and a real wise guy. And I remember wondering if this man actually had a disability, because he was playing the role so brilliantly, and he doesn't. And
Oh.
I've followed all of the, how dare the Rock take away one of our roles from us, and I follow all that, and I think they're very important conversations. And
I always think that's funny when they say, how dare The Rock take one of our roles away, as if the whole reason that movie got greenlit was The
Right.
Rock. Like, it's not as if like they were going to give you Steve Johnson,
Right. And someday maybe we'll go to that.
Right. I
I'm
mean, what we
forward to
need is
having
bankable
right.
movie stars with physical disabilities.
Yes, we
But don't
do.
kid yourself to think that, you were going to get $100 million movie greenlit, you Joe Schmo. Yeah.
Right. And so, and it was the same thing when Scarlett Johansson backed out of a
Yeah.
role that was about a transgender person,
Right.
and she hopefully I said that correctly. And she the transgender community was just like, why would you do that? Why not use, one of actors that is actually transgender, because we do have some
Right.
talent there.
Sure. And like Marley
So,
Matlin, was
right.
someone who was a legitimate star who also, I mean, the issue is we need more stars with physical.
Yeah, and so we've got to give people a chance, but we've got to watch it. And
Right.
also being an actor, just another
Yeah,
nuance in the conversation is playing different roles.
that's right.
Now, I'm living in the beautiful Commonwealth of Virginia, and we're having some very interesting conversations about why our governor and our lieutenant governor and our I
Yeah.
decided that it was okay in the 80s to wear blackface
Yeah.
and pose as blackface, and then have pose as a Ku
Yeah.
Klux Klan member.
Having gone to public school in Virginia in the 1970s and early 1980s, I could tell you why they thought it was okay, because there was a lot of racism. There was
Yep,
still a deep,
and there still is.
and I'm
Yeah.
sure there still is.
There's
It's
still,
just less
and not
acceptable.
just in Virginia, not just in
Right.
Virginia.
And not just in Virginia. I'm just saying, I actually happened
I
to
love
live
the
in Virginia.
Commonwealth of Virginia. Yes,
I'm not picking on Virginia. I'm just saying that we could, there's many other states, and northern states are just as bad. But,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, and right now Virginia is typically voting different from most of the other southern
Yes.
states. We're voting more blue.
Right.
And I won't get political, but it's just interesting watching
Yes.
that unfold. And I'm not commenting on it because but I will tell you, a friend of mine, she, around that same time, she went as a raisin to a Halloween party. And she said people were saying, are you posing as an African American? And she
Oh my
said,
God, yeah.
no, I'm a raisin. It says right here, kissed by sun kissed. I mean, got on a garbage bag, and I'm a raisin. So sometimes some of the stuff gets just
right.
ridiculous.
No, exactly. But I just want to say, I mean, for you, Deborah, what you do, you've built platform and visibility for the issue of disability, right?
Right.
Which is personal to you because you have a daughter, with Down syndrome. You, as you said, you yourself have non-visible disabilities. So you have a stake in this. You are passionate about it. You've put tons of resources into serving this community. I am going to say, I'm just going to go out and say it. You didn't put me up to this, but for anyone who wants to say, and I'm not saying that anyone is saying this, but for anyone who wants to say Deborah doesn't deserve or doesn't, she shouldn't be at the table, you have earned the right to be at the table. You are not doing what Rachel Dolezal did. You're not putting yourself in a wheelchair and pretending that you can't walk, right? You are saying, this is me, this is who I am, right? This is my life, and here's everything that I built up. And I think it's very self-defeating. Every movement has had allies. Every movement. The American Revolution, yes, George Washington was wonderful, but the French put a lot of resources into sticking it to the British to make sure that we had a country because they hated the British.
Yeah, not sticking it to the British, but and you know what we also were talking about before we came on air about Elizabeth Warren, but so I'm going to let you talk about that. But before you do, I want to tell you, I grew up in the South in the United States, and I have family in Florida, which was where I was born, in Alabama and Mississippi. I'm so Southern, North Carolina, and I was always very proud that in my history, in my family history, we have Cherokee Indian. My biological father is dark skinned with dark curly hair. I used to have dark curly hair before I became an elder, and so I was just always proud of that. And I would say, I've got Cherokee Indian in me. But then I did a DNA test, and it showed that I was white as white could be. 55% British, 20% Scottish, Irish, and I'm also very proud, I didn't know this, to be Norwegian, have Norwegian blood. So I'm just very, very Caucasian, but there wasn't any color in my DNA. And I just found it interesting. My son is engaged to a woman that is from India, and her family heritage is Indian and Myanmar, or
Myanmar, Burmese.
Burmese is what she calls it, but her skin color is gorgeous. It's a beautiful color that I wish I had, but it's so then you were mentioning before we went on air about this stuff with Elizabeth Warren. So I set it
Right.
up and I'll turn it over
Well,
to you.
I think the issue we get ourselves into when we get into trouble, there's a difference between allyship, right, and trying to represent yourself as something that you are not.
Right.
And Elizabeth Warren, I know she's talked about being Native American. I'm not going to get into. I'm not wise enough or smart enough to know enough about whether how do you become part of a tribe. I mean, there is actually. I know that there are guidelines about what it takes to actually be Native American. I know the Native American community doesn't want anything to do with Elizabeth Warren. I mean, that seems pretty clear. It's also really clear when you look at her that she has all the privileges of being a wealthy white woman, right? So part of the problem I think that she's gotten herself into is she, in some way or other, kind of represented herself as saying, this is my diversity story. I'm Native American, right?
Right.
And I think that whether it was intended or not, people kind of took that as it is a little bit like the Rachel Dolezal thing, where making yourself up, hey, I'm black when I'm not, and so I think that's where we get ourselves into trouble is when we don't. It's basically we're not owning our privilege. So that's my thing. When I walk into a room, and I spoke one time on Martin Luther King Day to a group of people that were all African American. I did not do it. I was asked to do it. I didn't want to do it, actually. I was very nervous to do it. And when I got up, the first thing I said is, I know what you're all thinking. You're like, why haven't we had Doug here before? Why hadn't we thought of this earlier? And I addressed the issue. I said, what am I doing here, right? What am I doing? Why am I here? And I think it's really important for underrepresented and people that are oppressed to hear that, for us to acknowledge, for the all of us have privilege, but particularly those of us who have more privilege than others, that it's important for us to acknowledge that privilege so that they can take a breath and go, yeah, I'm not crazy. Like, that really is the experience of the world. Like, one of the things that's very oppressive is when we tell people, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and I did it, you could do it, right? Without acknowledging the privilege that comes along with that. So I guess, if I had to sum it up, I mean, there's not a sum up, but it's sort of this paradox of, we have to be careful. I understand representation is really important. And the reality is that there are times when I may be asked to be on a panel that I should give up that seat to somebody else who hasn't been represented. And that's the right thing to do. And then there are other times where if someone says, but there's no seat for you ever again anywhere, that I think that that's a real mistake, because every movement, including the civil rights movement, there were white people in the civil rights movement, right? There were every movement.
We see pictures of it.
Absolutely.
Some really important pictures.
Some really important pictures and some really important people in the movement. So the idea that, and there were people who were not disabled who were in the disability community who helped pave the way for any of the progress that we have now. So I think that we have to be careful.
Yeah, what are you doing?
What are you doing with
that
your privilege?
Point, right? And one thing that we're doing with it is we're making sure that, the guest on last week was a gentleman with a disability that's in India, and I saw him on YouTube, and I thought it would be so interesting. So I am definitely giving a platform.
You're sharing your platform with him.
Yeah,
that's allyship.
Absolutely, and all of these other people, and often when I've just been invited to speak at an event, and I'm being asked to speak because I'm an expert on the topic. And then there is another woman that has been invited to speak who is also an expert on the topic, and she's brilliant, and she happens to also be blind. And so together we represent a very nice, it's a really good way of doing it. And I agree with you, Doug. We need to allow people to speak for themselves, the community to speak for themselves, but we have to be careful not to start cutting people out of our community and saying you don't belong because.
That's right.
So I think that's a very dangerous thing to head, and I think we need to have these conversations. And we don't know all the answers. Doug and I definitely don't know all the answers.
I definitely will not come out and say I have all the answers.
No. But I do think that these are really important important conversations to have, because I do believe that humanity is trying to rise and trying to evolve. And so the more we help each other, I mean, the reason why I have David Perez on my team in Costa Rica, who speaks Spanish and English, is because I find that the Spanish population are underrepresented in these conversations.
Right.
And so, and so I think the more we really include all of us in these conversations as much as possible and help each other be successful, I think we are all going to benefit from it. So, Doug,
Amen.
thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
having
Mary.
this interesting, nuanced, maybe difficult, thorny conversation. And please tell us what you're thinking and what suggestions you have. How do we make the world a better place for everybody? That, we applaud and we welcome any of your comments. So thank you for being on the show today, Doug. I appreciate
Thank you,
it.
as always.
And we will talk to everyone again. Please subscribe to the show in whatever way that you consume it. And we would appreciate you letting anyone know about our work, and always looking for great guests. Thank you. Bye-bye.